benefits from the booming business.
When I saw the bulldozers clearing the land, I was devastated. How could they bulldoze the land without my permission? They knew it belonged to me.
Expropriation, environmental destruction, starvation. The price for government and corporate greed. The selling out of a country. Dead donkeys fear no hyenas. Starts September 18th on DW.
This is DW News coming to you live from Berlin. Mainstream parties come out on top in two state elections in eastern Germany, but the far-right Alternative for Germany makes massive gains, securing second place in both Saxony and Brandenburg. We'll break down the results with our political editor. Also coming up, Hurricane Dorian wreaks havoc on the Bahamas. One of the largest storms to hit the island since records began is now heading to the U.S. Saudi-led airstrikes in Yemen have killed at least 100 people. Houthi rebels say aircraft dropped bombs on a detention center, killing most of the prisoners. Hello, I'm Terry Martin. Welcome to the program. We begin here in Germany, where the far-right AfD party has made significant gains in two state elections. The Alternative for Germany became the second strongest party in regional parliaments in both Saxony and Brandenburg. But the surge was not enough to unseat mainstream parties, which managed to maintain their top positions in both states.
CDU party leaders breathe a sigh of relief in Saxony. Chancellor Merkel's party has been in power here since German reunification. And they've retained control, despite suffering considerable losses.
We've done it. This is a message being sent out from Saxony tonight. A large majority of people who are standing up in a positive way for this country, who want something. The friendly Saxony has won. Many thanks to all of you.
But it'll be hard for Saxony's CDU to form a coalition. The centre-left SPD and environmentalist Greens did too poorly. State Premier Michael Kretschmer has ruled out a coalition with the far-right AfD, the state's second strongest party, which picked up a far greater share of votes than in the last election. The AfD also won more votes in Brandenburg, also becoming the second strongest party there, but they fell short of the victory they'd hoped for.
But this result, this prognosis shows one thing very clearly. The AfD is here to stay. Politics will no longer be able to be made by going around us.
The centre-left SPD remains the strongest party in Brandenburg, but they need two coalition partners to be able to rule.
It means that we continue to face great challenges in this country, to reach out to the people and work together with them. That is my goal for the coming years as well.
There's one thing that almost all parties can be happy about. Voter participation has risen considerably in both German states.
In the past few minutes, the AfD party leaders have given a press conference on their election performance. Co-chair Alexander Gauland predicted that sooner or later, mainstream parties would have to work with them.
If coalition building between the other parties doesn't work, then it will be very difficult for the CDU leadership. Especially in Saxony, where the CDU is very conservative. It will be very hard for them to justify their position of never dealing with the AfD. The election results will show that in the long term, we cannot be left out of decision-making. We are going to set the agenda.
DW's chief political editor, Michaela Kufner, has been attending that AfD press conference, which you just saw a small outtake from. Michaela, what did the AfD leaders have to say? For example, Alexander Gauland, who just spoke there.
Yes, I sense a certain sense of satisfaction there on Alexander Gauland's behalf, who, after all, is a former CDU politician, and who also said that in the other state that voted, the CDU leader there in Brandenburg would hardly survive this election result. Clearly, he wants to see the AfD become the next Big Ten party. He said so, and also push, and we heard it from his, in his very own words, set the agenda, which, you know, arguably, or actually undoubtedly, the AfD has done in the past. It has successfully set the agenda, partly also in this election campaign, in these regional elections, with the notable example, of course, of the Green Party, which didn't rise as high as some polls predicted, but clearly the issue of the environment was on the agenda there. But it's interesting, Alexander Gauland was somebody who didn't want the party to aim for government participation too fast. He was always concerned that it could be too early for the party, and clearly we're seeing here a co-party leader who's ready to go for it.
Now, the other AfD co-leader who was at that press conference, Jörg Meuthen, he stressed that these two regional results are an improvement in the party's vote, and a significant one, it must be said, that nearly doubled their showing. How significant is that surge in support for the AfD?
Well, there's two aspects to it. The AfD voted in eastern states where there was the most potential for them. I think it's safe to say that, according to the polling that we know. They are nowhere near achieving such a result in the West, and that's also something Jörg Meuthen was asked about, because the East feels very much emboldened by that. They clearly tapped into voter dissatisfaction here. The voter turnout, those non-voters that showed up, most of them actually went down as AfD voters in the end. So the other parties, yes, of course, they are happy about more voter turnout, but they would have been a lot happier if there had been more voter turnout for them, of course. So clearly the AfD claims the high ground here in these elections. That's something that's psychologically very important for the party. It's here, it's a voice that stays, it's a voice that got re-elected. That was very important for this very young party that's only 6 years old. But they are nowhere near from entering a regional or let alone the central government, because there's simply no other party willing to work with them. And from everything we've heard so far, that is not going to change anytime fast.
Now, one of the two party leaders there, Meuthen, he compared the AfD to Italy's far-right Populist League Party. The other co-leader, Alexander Gauland, said he thinks that some members of Chancellor Merkel's CDU party, especially in Saxony, are moving toward a situation where they might talk with the AfD or even think about discussing a possible coalition. Is the AfD on its way to becoming an accepted mainstream party of the right in Germany?
Well, that's a big question. I think it's a bit too early to really have an answer here this morning. But undoubtedly, I mean, the Northern League comparison somehow doesn't quite work, because Lega Nord came from or originated from the economically much stronger north of Italy. The AfD here is strongest in the economically somewhat weaker east. At the same time, voters say contradictory things. More than 80% say they feel economically rather satisfied with their own situation, and particularly in the east, the AfD voters, more than 70% say that they feel like second-class citizens. So there's a lot of psychology in this, but clearly it's a party that has been emboldened by this election result. And although Alexander Gauland noted with clear satisfaction that there might be tough times ahead for Alexander Kretschmer, the leader of the CDU in Saxony, to justify not joining forces with the AfD, because some parts of his own party, of Angela Merkel's CDU there, had been willing to do exactly that. This is something that has been once again ruled out both by him and almost more importantly, by the CDU leader Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, Angela Merkel's successor in that role. So this is simply not on the cards for now, but we're in for very interesting coalition talks indeed.
DW Chief Political Editor Michaela Kufner, thank you very much, Michaela. Now, for more analysis, with me here in the studio is Franziska Brandner. She's a member of the German Parliament for the Green Party, and she is the Green Party's European Affairs spokesperson. Thank you very much for being with us this morning. I want to talk about your party's performance in these elections in just a moment, but first I'd like to get your reaction to the surge in support for the far-right Alternative for Germany. How is that changing Germany's political landscape?
I think that the AfD has won, and especially in Saxony, but we also still have to consider that 75% have not voted for them and have voted democratically, and also that there has been, a new sign for new governments coming up, which can be formed without the AfD. So I think there's still a duty to convince many people that democracy can and will work for them, and that's sort of the big duty of every single democratic party. But I think, many expected it much worse. There's no sign of relief, but I think it's our job now to convince everybody, the quarter, that democracy works. So I think there is black and white in it.
Just a few weeks ago, your party was polling much higher than it ended up doing in these two regional elections. How do you explain that?
We have seen a race in both states between number one and two, be it the AfD or the Conservative Party in Saxony or the Social Democrats in Brandenburg. And we've seen those dynamics, for example, in France. If it's between the right-wing party, the very populist party, and the Democratic Party, the center usually then votes strategically and votes for either the Conservative or the Social Democrats to be number one.
So you're saying that votes that could have gone to your party ended up going to the Social Democrats in order to block the AfD, or going to the CDU for that matter, in Saxony to block the AfD.
Yeah, and given that dynamic in the last couple of weeks, we're still, happy that we increased our vote, that we won for the first time directly elected members of parliament in East Germany. We have one in Brandenburg, 3 in Saxony. For us, that's quite impressive. We, of course, would always have liked to be better, but given the dynamics, I think we have achieved quite a lot.
Are you expecting to join the governments then in Brandenburg and Saxony?
I think the voters have given a signal that the current governments are not fit for purpose, and that they want to have an enlargement of the governments. And I think in both countries we will have serious government negotiations, and I hope that we can, make our impact in these countries, making them more sustainable, more social, improve the infrastructure, especially in the countryside. That's the big challenge in both countries.
Franziska Brandner, member of the German Parliament for the Green Party and the European Affairs spokesperson for the Greens in the German Parliament. Thank you very much for being with us this morning.
Thank you.
Here's some of the other stories making headlines around the world today. Hostilities are flaring on the Israel-Lebanon border. The Lebanese militant group Hezbollah fired a volley of anti-tank missiles at an Israeli army base on Sunday. Israel responded by shelling a village in Lebanon. No casualties were reported. Thousands of people have joined an anti-India rally in Karachi. It's the 4th week of protests in the Pakistani city following India's move to strip Muslim-majority Kashmir of its autonomy. And in Hong Kong, a general strike called by activists after a weekend of protest and violence has gained sporadic support. Workers in one hospital formed a human chain after walking off the job. Hundreds of students stayed away from school on this, the first day of the new school year for many. An airstrike by the Saudi-led coalition fighting in Yemen has hit a detention center, killing at least 100 prisoners, according to officials for the Houthi rebel group. Locals said the building was being used to detain people opposed to the Houthis. The head of the International Red Cross in Yemen toured the site and suggested the death toll could rise. Frank Rauchenstein said the center held around 170 people, and only 40 had survived. The Saudi-led coalition said it had attacked a militant target. The The devastating war in Yemen has been raging since 2015, and it's far from over. Our correspondent, Fani Fachar, was just there and joins us now. Fani, good to see you. Not many journalists managed to make it into Yemen. What can you tell us about what's happening there?
Right, it's very, very difficult to receive access to this country. It took me personally almost 1 year to get inside the country. And when I was there, I experienced a very fluid situation when it comes to the question, who is actually in charge of the interim government place, which is in Aden, in the south of the country. You have to imagine when you go through Aden and around Aden, you have to pass through different checkpoints. And the most repeated sentence that I've heard by Yemenis was, when we wake up in the morning, we really don't know who is in charge. Is it the separatists who are dreaming of an own state? Basically, they want to return to a situation the way it was up until 1990, when Yemen was basically two countries, the north and the south. Is it controlled by the Emiratis, part of the Saudi-led coalition? Is it controlled by whatever is left of the government? And then, of course, we cannot forget that there are also jihadis that are active in Aden and in the south. So within that very complex and unstable situation, it is where I met Fatima Al-Marouk within a hospital, a very young doctor who said she had a completely different vision and expectation when it comes to the job of being a doctor before she started her medical studies, before the war started. This is her story. Let's have a look. Things can change in seconds at this intensive care unit in Aden. This is Janat. She's 18 months old and has been diagnosed with malaria and malnutrition. She's hovering between life and death.
Did you request oxygen? There is nothing. The oxygen bottle in the room doesn't work.
The doctor, Fatima, must improvise. It's not the first time she has felt helpless. Steam inhalation is the only option available for Janat at the moment.
It's not, she's now barely taking breath. See, her, breathing is so fast, so she needs oxygen right away.
Fatima's shift is just beginning. The oxygen bottle is delivered after all. Janat will make it. Many children do not. For Fatima, the fact that oxygen cannot always be provided on time is depressing. When she began her medical studies before the war, shortages were unheard of.
I was feeling optimistic. I was really looking forward to graduate, but it's just so difficult to afford living, even for doctors that considered, the higher jobs here in the country.
Happiness comes in small doses here. This father is relieved his daughter is gaining some weight for now. There are not enough doctors, and most of those here must work unpaid. Hospitals cannot cope. It's not just a lack of food in Yemen that brings a lot of people, especially malnourished children, to this hospital. Once they arrive, they face another problem, lack of medical supplies. And there's not enough space. Simply, there aren't enough beds for all these children. These children are new patients waiting in the hallway for admission.
Yeah.
Fatima was not prepared for this level of stress. After a 24-hour shift, she finally finds sanctuary at home. Photography helps her to unwind. At the age of 26, she finds her job overwhelming.
It makes me feel that I am not still working and just forget it all and living it all in the hospital and starting a new day, new life maybe. But
she wants to continue her medical studies in Germany. Her father, a geologist, used to live there in the 1980s.
Papa, do you think the war in Yemen will end?
Inshallah, but it will require a lot of time.
How long?
Nobody knows, but we hope the war ends for our children because the people are suffering and they are in bad shape. There's no stability, nothing. No salary, no jobs. The youth is lost now.
With the future so bleak, Fatima doesn't know how long she will stay in Yemen working unpaid. She wants to continue working as a doctor to help people, but she also wants better opportunities of her own, if possible, outside of Yemen.
So it's very difficult just to get access to medical care in Yemen. Tell us more about the humanitarian situation in the country. How bad is it?
The situation is dire, not only in Aden, in many parts of Yemen, especially in the north, which is controlled by the Houthi rebels, the people that basically the Yemeni government is fighting since 2014 and with the Saudi-led coalition since 2015. But what's also a problem here is not just having access to food, but rather who's controlling that food. In fact, the World Food Programme said that they are temporarily suspending distribution of aid in the north because they claim that the Houthis have been stealing that food and distributing it among their fighters. But even if you get close to a distribution site, there's still the question, do you have enough fuel to go to that site and gather that food for your family? So there are a lot of situations and challenges that make that add an extra level of hardship to the situation on the ground. Now, what comes as a result of an ongoing war for almost 5 years now, it's the 5th year that the Yemen war is developing, it has become so complex. A lot of people don't even understand who is fighting here against whom anymore. And the people on the ground, the only thing that they feel, and they also share with me, they just feel abandoned. They don't feel just abandoned by their government. They don't just feel abandoned by a lack of system, mismanagement within the country and corruption, but also a lack of international help and aid and constant attention to the actual conflict going on for so many years now on the ground.
Let's talk about the international dimension to some degree. There is a civil war going on in Yemen, but it's also a proxy war to some degree with Iran on the one side and Saudi Arabia and the Emirates on the other. Is there any prospect of this coming to an end anytime soon?
At this point, no, to bluntly spoken, because it's not just the proxy war that you just laid out, the Houthis apparently supported by Iran and between Iran and Saudi Arabia, or it's not just the civil war between the Yemeni government supported by the Saudi-led coalition and the Houthis, but there's a civil war within the civil war developing. Shortly after I left Aden, there were attacks in Aden itself. The separatists, dreaming of their own state, are trying to fill a void that seems to be left behind by the United Arab Emirates, who are withdrawing their forces, they say, in order to help the peace process. But at the same time, what's happening on the ground, there are new front lines opening up. So just from me talking right now, you realize that it's very, very complex. So talking about the peace process at this point, yes, a lot of talks can be made, but unfortunately, on the ground, there's no action, no vivid action in terms of whether peace will actually come about anytime soon.
Fanny, thank you so much for bringing us up to date there. DW International Correspondent Fanny Facha. U.S. states of Florida, Georgia, and South Carolina have issued evacuation orders as Hurricane Dorian approaches. As many as 1 million people could be forced to leave their homes. The powerful storm is forecast to hit the eastern seaboard of the United States by Tuesday. Dorian is currently pounding the northern Bahamas.
Hurricane Dorian slammed into the southwestern Bahamas as a huge Category 5 storm, packing winds of nearly 300 kilometers an hour. Officials warn storm surges up to 7 meters high could be life-threatening in the low-lying island chain. Bahamian Prime Minister Hubert Minnis said parts of the island where Dorian made landfall were already flooded.
Parts of it is already underwater, and some areas you cannot tell the difference as to the beginning of the street versus where the ocean begins. And they've not yet been hit by the brunt of the storm.
US weather officials called Dorian, quote, the strongest hurricane in modern records for the northwestern Bahamas. The storm's huge size and power become apparent when seen from space, like in these NASA images filmed from the International Space Station. Meteorologists say Dorian might veer back out to sea, away from the eastern US, but it might also slam headlong into the southeastern coast.
We just don't know when exactly it's going to turn north. It could turn north. Obviously, we want to have that turn as quickly as possible to minimize the impacts on Florida. But if you look at the forecast, it absolutely could impact the coast and turn once it hits the coast. And so we've got to prepare for that eventuality.
As here in Florida, people all along the southeast coast are preparing for the impact of one of the fiercest hurricanes for a long time.
Bundesliga soccer now, and Werder Bremen were desperate for a home victory against Augsburg after losing their first 2 matches this season. A man from Japan ended up making the difference.
Werder Bremen coach Florian Kohfeldt received the backing of the fans after a bad start to the season. They were looking for their first points against Augsburg, with Europe their aim this term. And the home crowd soon had something to shout about. Yuya Osako making it 1-0 after just 6 minutes. Augsburg's defensive line was far too high. But the visitors hit back, Stefan Lichtsteiner finding fellow Swiss Ruben Vargas for the equaliser. The two recent arrivals showing a great understanding. Bremen, though, continued to threaten, and Josh Sargent showed superb skill to put them back in front on 21 minutes. The 19-year-old American is already making a name for himself in northern Germany. It got better for the hosts when Lichtsteiner picked up a second booking and was sent off just after the half-hour mark. But instead of falling apart, Augsburg regrouped for the second half, and Vargas grabbed his and his side's second right after the restart. Game on! Bremen's extra man began to tell, however, and Japan's Osako snatched the winner for 3-2 on 67 minutes. His third goal of the season, the same amount he managed in the whole of the last campaign. Augsburg are still to get their first win, but Bremen are now off the mark.
Ferrari's Charles Leclerc has won his first ever Formula One Grand Prix in Belgium, but his victory was tinged with sadness after a good friend Antoine Hubert was killed in a crash at the same track on Saturday.
Everyone's thoughts on the grid in Belgium were with the brother and mother of Antoine Hubert, who died after a high-speed crash in the second-tier Formula 2 race on Saturday. Monaco's Charles Leclerc grew up with Frenchman Hubert in junior racing. He had taken pole in Spa just hours before his 22-year-old friend was killed. The continued dangers of motor racing were clear, with several collisions during the race. Luckily, no one was hurt. Leclerc was fairly untroubled en route to his maiden Formula One win at the age of just 21. It was also Ferrari's first victory of a year that supposedly promised so much. But the celebrations were muted from both team and driver, who dedicated the win to Hubert.
Yeah, on one hand, I've got a dream since being a child that has been realized. On the other hand, it has been a very difficult weekend since yesterday. We have lost a friend, first of all, but it's very difficult in these situations. So I would like to dedicate my first win to him.
Lewis Hamilton was second as a sixth Formula One title draws near. A sad weekend for motorsport, yet the racing goes on next weekend in Italy.
You're watching DW News. Business news is next. The U.S.-China trade war is entering the next stage with new tariffs on products worth hundreds of billions of dollars. We'll talk to an expert about what could happen next. This is DW News. Our top story, leaders from the far-right Alternative for Germany say mainstream parties will have to reconsider their refusal to work with them after making big gains in state elections. Despite the populist surge, mainstream parties managed to retain control of governments in Saxony and Brandenburg. You're watching DW News from Berlin. Thanks for being with us.
seems. You must find the truth. But be careful. We have always feared Elsa's powers were too much for this world. Now we must hope they are enough.
Get ready for a close encounter of the furred kind. Farmageddon, a Shaun the Sheep movie.